Tom Pelissero, great insider reporter for the NFL Network, joining us on the program. Who had the best week in the NFL?
Dan, I was thinking about this morning. So when you're doing this the way that we do it on NFL Network, and it's just this flood of news, there's so many transactions. I this morning just started scrolling through one of the pages on NFL.com to remember who had signed who, because you completely lose track of everything. Like eventually there'll be some point where I'm into training camp, I know in August, and I'll go, that guy's on that team. And then I'll go, I broke that. I'm the one who reported it, and I don't even remember that happening because then there were 100 other things in that same day. I mean, I think that the teams you look at that have kind of, certainly used their resources the most, the Falcons did a lot, starting with the Jesse Bates deal that they did. They wanted to pump money into that defense. That was a huge part of it. The Bears going out and spending the way that they did just in the opening hours of free agency, getting Tremaine Edmonds on an $18 million a year deal, bringing in TJ Edwards. Matt Eberflus's defense runs through. It's the interior defensive line. It's the linebackers. They signed a couple of big time linebackers. And then you always have to look at the quarterback moves too, because those ended up being the most, over time, those end up being right or wrong, good or bad. They end up being the most impactful. So the Raiders making an investment in Jimmy Garoppolo, whose contract basically dictates he's going to be their starter for at least 2 years. Obviously, go back to before the start of free agency, and the Derek Carr move was significant. Even things like yesterday with Gardner Minshew going to the Colts, they're sitting there with the number 4 pick, but Gardner Minshew could be their starting quarterback in 2023. Last year, most of those quarterback trades that we saw did not work out. I mean, Matt Ryan, Carson Wentz, Russell Wilson, at least in the short term with Wilson, you did not get the returns on that. So it's always a little bit of a guessing game here. People make big time bets. There's a reason these free agents generally become available. You never want to build through free agency, but there were some teams with a lot of cap space like the Bears who made some big time moves, to say nothing of the move they made, trade the number 1 pick and getting DJ Moore as a part of it.
When Rodgers was on McAfee on Wednesday, and after he started talking about he wants to go to the Jets or plans on going to the Jets, and I kept thinking, and we had some analysts on who said that the Packers don't have much leverage, and I go, why don't they have leverage? They can say, oh, he really wants to go there. You want to bring in some of his ex-teammates. Just because we don't want him doesn't mean we don't have leverage in what we want back from the Jets. And now you're hearing, the Packers, they want to have a little bit more than maybe what we thought. How do you think this plays out? When do you think this finally plays out?
So here's what I can tell you, Dan, based upon what I know. And there's obviously been a lot of moving parts. I did appreciate that Aaron Rodgers really narrowed us to the one actual issue, which those of us who have been kind of covering it behind the scenes have known, which is trade compensation is the only holdup that's left in this trade. So there's a couple of important checkpoints here just in terms of the timeline. The first one would be the NFL draft, which is still over a month away. I think that we would all love if there's resolution right now, but both sides have their viewpoints. My understanding is they're not far apart on the compensation, but they're not close either. So the draft is an important checkpoint, not because what happens in Aaron Rodgers impacts who you're going to draft, because I think that we're all on the same page that ultimately Rodgers, barring something going totally sideways, will be the Jets quarterback in 2023. But it's about the fact that once you get past that draft, you're not talking about 2023 draft picks anymore.
Yeah.
From just a strict value standpoint, you're downgrading. If you're getting a 2024 pick instead of a 2023 pick, that's like downgrading it by a round. So there's a pressure point there potentially for the Packers where the Jets could say, hey, this is your last chance to get a premium pick or two in the 2023 draft. If you don't do this, we'll keep talking. But now you're talking about picks that don't help you this year. So that's one checkpoint. If somehow you got past the draft, then the next checkpoint really isn't until September. Yes, there'll be a pressure point prior to the start of training camp, because let's face it, Aaron Rodgers has not shown up in the past couple of years for the Packers OTAs. Maybe he would show up in a new situation in New York, but there's no guarantee of that. And he sidestepped that question on Pat McAfee. You would like to get him into training camp, so you would anticipate there's going to be more conversations there. But the Packers don't have to do anything until the day before the regular season opener, because that's when you have the trigger where they would have to pull the trigger on Aaron Rodgers' option bonus. So you don't want to get there, because then you're potentially paying a guy $60 million who's not really part of your future plans. But for the Jets, you don't want to get it there because then Rodgers isn't even in training camp with the team. So those are kind of the moving parts here along the timeline. This could, depending who wants to push it, this absolutely could go at least until the start of training camp, maybe into training camp before you have a resolution. I'm not sure that's in anyone's best interest to drag it out that long. But we'll see if the Jets aren't willing to come up to the Packers' price, and if the Packers are not willing to lower their price, you're going to have a stare down for as long as these teams allow it to go.
Yeah, I hope it goes as follows, that maybe you give a second-round pick in this year's draft, conditional first-round pick next year compared to what Aaron Rodgers does, performance. It could be performance-based, that maybe you're going to get a second and a first as opposed to 2 first-round picks. What do you think?
They're not even looking for 2 first-round picks. The
they're
Packers
not.
aren't asking for 2 ones.
Okay.
They that's not part of the conversation right now. Right now, it is less than that. It's less than the Russell Wilson trade, which was 2 ones, 2 twos, and 3 players. It's less than the Matthew Stafford trade, depending how you do the math on that, which was 2 ones and Jared Goff, which then the Lions had to take on his contract. So it's a little bit different calculus there. The Packers price is lower than that, but certainly it's higher than what they got for Brett Favre to the Jets once upon a time 15 years ago, which was a 4th-round pick at that time. The parallels here, Dan, are fascinating to me. There are some key differences. And I was on the beat with the Green Bay Press-Gazette in 2008. So I was living that in Green Bay, Wisconsin in the prior divorce. And I remember vividly, Favre coming in because that one did go. It started up roughly the same time. To go back to that timeline, it was the Packers wanted an answer from Aaron Rodgers early in the offseason. That happened again here with Aaron Rodgers. Obviously, Favre announced his retirement, but by late March, he decided he wanted to come back. Rodgers just kind of sliced that part out of the equation. And then you had very public interviews with Favre. It was on Greta Van Susteren on Fox News. With Rodgers, it's on the Pat McAfee show where you have the exchange. And then you had Ted Thompson, who was a famously reticent individual. I was one of the people who had to do some of the series of one-on-ones with Ted on a hot June Saturday morning because Favre was saying so much and it was swinging the public perception. And you had this went back and forth. And ultimately, in that case, the Packers came down to 2 teams that they were potentially going to trade Brett Favre to. It was the Bucs and it was the Jets. And the Jets made their pitch with Woody Johnson and you can hunt on this land that we've got outside of town. There was this whole thing that went into it and they convinced him. But Favre wanted to go to Tampa because he would have gotten to face the Packers that year. With Rodgers, again, he's very much trying to dictate this. I intend to play with the Jets. And the Packers allowed the Jets to talk to him, even though at that time they weren't able to agree on the compensation. Now they're trying to work out that compensation after Rodgers already declared his intentions. There's leverage points on both sides here. But I'm just, it's the easy joke, Dan, but you still have to look at Kirk Cousins has an expiring contract and the possibility could Aaron Rodgers be a Viking in 2024. I'm not saying that. I'm not speculating that. I'm not reporting that.
Don't do
hypothetically,
that. Don't do
hypothetically, and frankly, you got 2 guys who are, in both cases kind of made clear they're doing this at least partly out of spite. With Favre, it was very much he wanted to play again because the Packers said he was done and they tried to make him stay retired and then he ends up going to the Vikings. With Rodgers, he said he's 90% retired. When he goes into the darkness, he comes out. Some other players are telling him that they want to get rid of you and he decides, you know what, I want to play for the Jets. It's, as one of my former colleagues at the Press Gazette said to me recently, these guys all end up being the same guy. It never ends well. You can say Rodgers learned all the lessons from Favre, and he did. There were a lot of things that Aaron took with him throughout his career in Green Bay, and they're both phenomenal players and fun guys to cover. But in the end, if you still have a guy who wants to play and he feels like he's not wanted, there's no way for that to end cleanly for everybody involved.
Tom Pelissero, NFL Network insider. Before I let you go, Lamar Jackson had a tweet where he congratulated Orlando Brown Jr. for getting the contract with the Bengals. Then he says, when this is all said and done, I feel bad for the rest of the 31, the other 31 teams. What's he saying in this tweet?
Seems like Lamar, and I did not see that tweet, but certainly seems like that's the message of if you're not the team that gets me, you're going to regret it. It still remains to be seen, Dan. And I know that there's a lot of people who have brought up collusion, have even suggested racism, have suggested a variety of different reasons why nobody's willing to just go out. People say he's just sitting there. Lamar Jackson, MVP, is just sitting there. Think of it this way. And I had a lot of conversations yesterday in particular with people with different teams who potentially could be in that market. And it's not to say, and in no way am I saying nobody should go out and try to get one of the dynamic players within the NFL, but it has to be a specific situation. There are a number of teams. You can easily cross off of the 32. You can cross off 20 teams just by going through and saying who has a young quarterback already that they're going to pay, or who has a bunch of money tied up in a veteran quarterback. There's about 20 teams you can cross right off the list. So now you're down to about a dozen of them. You've got teams that either may have a quarterback who they're going with for now, or they have some money invested. There's probably a half dozen of those who you can kind of say it's probably not going to happen there. Now you're down to a half dozen of them. And you need to figure out, it's not just go get the quarterback. This isn't fantasy football. It's not Madden. It's real life where there's contracts and there's value and there's scheme. So if you're going to go after Lamar Jackson, if you're going to evaluate this, and certainly there's teams that have, you need to be willing to give up the 2 first-round picks to pay him what he wants, which he has not backed off of, which is a fully guaranteed contract. It's going to be in the neighborhood of $50 million a year, which is about 25% of your salary cap. You're doing that with a player who you're going to need to change your scheme, to change at least some of your personnel to make it go. And he's a player whose mobility has always been a big part of his game. And he suffered consecutive lower body injuries that have ended his season. Speed, mobility, those are by definition depreciating assets. In other words, those injuries are something real to consider that teams absolutely look at. It's not to say that means Lamar Jackson's never going to be MVP caliber Lamar Jackson again. I think we can agree, Dan, when you watch him, when he's healthy, when he's on the field, he's pretty good. He's pretty fun to watch. But also, you can cite the passing efficiency and the explosive plays. Well, big part of the reason he has that is because when the quarterback is a run threat, it changes the numbers on the defense. You have to account for the quarterback as a runner. It changes how defenses can play. You're going to see more specific types of coverages, and the picture is going to be clearer on the back end where you're going to have those opportunities. Lamar absolutely has gotten better as a passer. He's absolutely an unbelievably dynamic runner. But are you willing to make that type of investment? And remember, too, you do have limited resources in terms of building your team. Part of the reason that you've seen this shift toward people wanting more and more to build around a young quarterback is the salary cap. It's cash, it's resources. It's the fact that when you're not paying $50 million a year for a quarterback, which is soon going to be the going rate, and then we'll be talking about the first $60 million quarterback with the way the cap's going, that's money you're not spending to put people around him. If you're the Bears and you have Justin Fields, and you might say, well, Lamar's right now a more polished passer, and he's as dynamic of a runner, we could get him, but then that's $50 million or $45 million that we don't have to spend on other things. So we have Justin Fields right now on a rookie contract. Those are all the things that you have to evaluate here in terms of the value of the position, in terms of the value of the player. And that's not a slight to Lamar, and that's not collusion, and that's not racism. It's the reality of team building in the modern NFL, where you're going to be hard-pressed to find teams that have had a great deal of success after committing 20% plus of their salary cap to a single player. The Chiefs are doing it with Patrick Mahomes on a unique deal. They paid him $60 million over the first 3 years, and it's a long-term contract that gives him a lot of flexibility. And that was the intention when he did that contract. Most quarterback contracts are not like that. There is a cap and a cash impact on you. That's going to influence things in terms of Lamar Jackson. And there's some fascinating conversations that can be had, particularly if in the coming weeks here, as you're seeing these chairs get filled around the league, Lamar does not have an offer sheet, then your attention starts to be turned to what does he do with a $32 million franchise tag? Does he go back to Baltimore? He potentially could stay away all the way until I believe it's week 10, that he could still sign an offer sheet with the team and then show up at that point. That would seem, for a guy who played for 1.7 in 2021 and 23 million, I believe it was, in 2022, an odd strategy to suddenly start giving up all those millions of dollars. But at the same time, if Lamar had an agent, that agent would have advised him 2 years ago, you're not stepping on the field for 2021 at 1.7 million. He's already given up tens of millions of dollars. and he's got to evaluate now. Do you continue to go down that path, or do you take the best offer you can possibly get, even if it's not fully guaranteed, whether that's from the Ravens, who have been trying for a couple of years, or potentially someone else?
Have a great weekend, Tom. Thank you. We appreciate your time.
Always a pleasure, Dan. Thanks.
That's Tom Pelissero. He works for NFL Network.